There are moments in history when a single voice cuts through the silence and changes the world forever. Imagine Paris in the winter of 1949, a woman sitting alone in a quiet cafe, her pen moving across paper, writing words that would ignite a revolution she never fully intended to lead. Her name was Simone de Beauvoir, and with one sentence, she shattered centuries of assumption. One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman. These words, quiet as snowfall, would echo across generations, waking millions to question the invisible chains wrapped around their lives. Tonight, as the world grows still and the light fades softly around you, let us journey back to her beginning, to the streets of Paris, to the wars and loves and whispers that shaped her, and to the book that changed what it means to be human. This is not just her story. It is the story of awakening itself. Before we step into her world, let me ask something gentle of you. If these words tonight carry you closer to rest, if they walk beside you into sleep, then perhaps this channel could become a familiar companion, a quiet place you return to when the night calls. Let it stay with you softly, like a trusted friend. And now, let us begin. Paris in the early years of the 20th century was a city of contradictions. It gleamed with the promise of modernity, its streets lit by electric lamps, its boulevards alive with the hum of automobiles and the rustle of silk. Yet beneath that glittering surface, the old rules held firm. Women wore corsets that bound their bodies as tightly as society bound their choices. They were educated, yes, but only enough to be charming. They were taught to read, but discouraged from thinking too deeply. They were prepared for one destiny above all others: to marry well, to manage a household, to disappear gracefully into the background of a man's life. Into this world, on January 9, 1908, Simone Lucie Ernestine Marie Bertrand de Beauvoir was born. Her name alone carried the weight of expectation, each syllable a reminder of the aristocratic lineage her father cherished, even as that lineage crumbled beneath the pressures of a changing world. Her father, Georges Bertrand de Beauvoir, was a lawyer who loved the theater more than the law. He was charming, witty, a man who could recite entire scenes from Molière, and who believed deeply in the superiority of French culture and the natural order of things. That natural order, of course, placed men at the center and women in the margins. Her mother, Françoise Brasseur, came from a wealthier family, but her wealth was measured in piety as much as in francs. She was devoutly Catholic, a woman who attended Mass daily and who believed that suffering was a pathway to God. She wanted her daughters, Simone and her younger sister Helene, to grow up as she had, obedient, faithful, prepared to serve. Between these two forces, the theatrical atheist and the quiet believer, young Simone was caught, and perhaps it was that very tension that taught her to think for herself. As a child, Simone was precocious in a way that delighted her father and worried her mother. She learned to read early, devouring books with a hunger that never seemed satisfied. Her father would sit her on his knee and test her knowledge, applauding when she answered correctly, calling her his little genius. But there was something conditional in his affection. He loved her cleverness, but only to a point. He loved her spirit, but only as long as it remained decorative. He did not imagine, could not imagine, that this daughter of his would one day use that cleverness to dismantle the very world he cherished. Her mother, meanwhile, watched with quiet concern. Intelligence in a girl was acceptable, even charming, but too much of it could be dangerous. It could make her unmarriageable. It could make her unhappy. And so Françoise prayed, hoping that Simone's brightness would eventually soften into something more manageable. But Simone did not soften. She questioned everything. Why must she kneel in church when the prayers felt empty? Why must she lower her eyes when men spoke? Why were the stories in her books always about boys who went on adventures while girls waited at home? Her cousin Jacques, whom she adored with the fierce, uncomplicated love of childhood, was allowed freedoms she could only dream of. He could roam the streets. He could argue with adults. He could imagine a future that was his to shape. Simone, by contrast, was told to sit still, to be quiet, to prepare herself for a life that had already been written. And somewhere deep inside her, even as a child, she began to resist. Not loudly, not with tantrums or rebellion, but with questions. Always questions. The family lived in an apartment on the Boulevard du Montparnasse, in a neighborhood that was slowly shedding its bourgeois respectability and becoming the haunt of artists and intellectuals. Simone would watch from the window as painters carried their canvases through the streets, as poets argued in cafes, as women in bohemian dresses walked with a freedom she could only imagine. The world outside was changing, even if the world inside her home was not. Her father insisted on keeping up appearances, even as his income dwindled. They employed a maid they could barely afford. They wore clothes that were tailored but increasingly out of fashion. They pretended, as so many families did, that nothing was wrong. But Simone noticed the whispers, the tension, the way her mother's face tightened when bills arrived. She noticed that other girls had dowries being prepared, that marriages were being arranged, and that her own future was becoming uncertain. The First World War arrived when Simone was 6 years old, and with it came a shift that would alter everything. Her father's legal practice suffered. Clients disappeared. Money, already tight, became scarce. The family moved to a smaller apartment. Luxuries vanished. And with them, the assumption that Simone would marry into wealth and security. For many girls, this would have been a tragedy. But for Simone, it was a kind of liberation. If she could not rely on marriage to define her future, then she would have to define it herself. Her parents, reluctantly, began to accept that their eldest daughter might need to work, might need an education that went beyond the merely decorative. And so, at the age of 10, Simone was enrolled at the Cours des Sires, a Catholic school for girls, where she would spend the next 8 years. The Cours des Sires was a world of polished floors and strict routines, where girls were taught literature and languages, but always with the understanding that knowledge was a tool for refinement, not for power. Simone excelled immediately. She was at the top of her class in nearly every subject, and her teachers praised her diligence. But even as she absorbed their lessons, she began to notice the limits of what they were willing to teach. History was sanitized. Philosophy was absent. Questions that probed too deeply were redirected. And slowly, quietly, Simone began to realize that the education she was receiving was designed not to free her mind, but to decorate it. She wanted more. She needed more. And so she began to educate herself, reading her father's books in secret, borrowing volumes from friends, constructing in her own mind the education she was being denied. It was during these years that her faith began to unravel. Her mother took her to Mass every Sunday, and Simone went obediently, kneeling and praying as she was supposed to. But the rituals felt hollow. The answers the priests offered felt insufficient. She read the lives of the saints and found herself not inspired but confused. If God was good, why was there so much suffering? If women were meant to be modest and silent, Why did that modesty feel like erasure? She tried to believe. She wanted to believe, if only to please her mother. But by the time she was 14, the effort had become unbearable. One afternoon, walking home from school, she simply stopped pretending. She did not announce her atheism. She did not argue or rebel. She simply let go quietly and felt a strange sense of relief. If there was no God, then there was no divine plan. If there was no divine plan, then she was free to create her own. The loss of faith was not a dramatic rupture, but a quiet shedding, like a skin that no longer fit. Simone told no one at first, not even her mother, though Francoise must have sensed the change. The girl who had once knelt so obediently in church now seemed distant during prayers, her eyes unfocused, her mind clearly elsewhere. But Simone had learned early the art of concealment, the small performances required to keep peace in a household where appearances mattered more than truth. She continued to attend Mass, continued to bow her head, but inside she was free. And that freedom, though invisible to everyone around her, was the most real thing she had ever known. Without the framework of religion to guide her, Simone began constructing her own moral compass. She read voraciously anything she could find. Her father's library, though modest, contained the classics: Balzac, Flaubert, Dostoevsky. She devoured them all, absorbing not just the stories, but the questions they raised about human nature, about society, about the vast distance between what people said they believed and how they actually lived. She read about women trapped in loveless marriages, about men who built empires on the backs of the poor, about children born into circumstances they could never escape. And she began to understand that the world was not simply the way it was because God had ordained it. The world was the way it was because people had built it that way. And if people had built it, then people could change it. Her friendships during these years were intense and complicated. At the Cours de Cire, she became close to a girl named Zaza, Elizabeth Lecoyne, whose intelligence matched her own. Zaza was everything Simone was not: effortlessly graceful, deeply devout, beloved by everyone. Where Simone questioned, Zaza accepted. Where Simone bristled against convention, Zaza seemed to float through it without friction. And yet, beneath Zaza's perfect surface, Simone sensed a kindred spirit, someone who also felt the weight of expectation, who also dreamed of something beyond the narrow path laid out for girls like them. They spent hours together, talking about books and ideas, walking through the Luxembourg Gardens, imagining futures that felt both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. Simone loved her fiercely, protectively, and in Zaza she saw both what she might become and what she feared becoming: a woman whose brilliance was smothered beneath the demands of duty. As Simone moved through her teenage years, the tension in her household grew. Her father, though he had once delighted in her cleverness, now seemed unsettled by it. She argued with him about politics, about literature, about the role of women. He would laugh at first, indulgent, treating her opinions as the charming eccentricities of youth. But when she refused to back down, when she met his arguments with her own, his amusement curdled into irritation. He began to call her difficult, stubborn, unwomanly. Her mother, caught between them, tried to smooth things over, urging Simone to be more agreeable, to think of her future. But Simone could not pretend. She had tasted intellectual freedom, and she would not give it up, not even to keep the peace. The question of marriage loomed over everything. Without a dowry, without significant family wealth, Simone's prospects were uncertain. Her parents spoke in vague terms about finding her a suitable match, but as the years passed and no suitors appeared, the conversation grew strained. Simone herself felt no urgency. The idea of marriage, as she understood it, was suffocating. She had watched her mother's life, the slow erosion of self that came with constant service to others. She had seen the way married women in her social circle spoke in hushed tones about their disappointments, their private griefs. Marriage, it seemed to her, was not a partnership but a form of disappearance. The woman ceased to exist as an individual and became instead an extension of her husband, her identity absorbed into his. And Simone, who had fought so hard to become herself, could not imagine willingly surrendering that self to anyone. Her teachers at the Cours de Cire recognized her brilliance but did not quite know what to do with it. They encouraged her studies, but always with the implicit understanding that education for a woman was ultimately decorative. She would not use her learning to build a career, they assumed. She would use it to be an interesting wife, to raise cultured children, to manage a household with intelligence and grace. But Simone had other plans. She had begun to dream of the Sorbonne, the great university where the most brilliant minds in France gathered to debate and discover. It was an audacious dream. Few women attended university at all, and those who did were often viewed with suspicion, as unnatural, as failures in the essential task of femininity. But Simone did not care. She wanted to study philosophy, to engage with the deepest questions of existence, to be taken seriously not as a woman but as a thinker. Her father resisted at first. University was expensive, and the family's financial situation remained precarious. More than that, he worried about what it would mean for her future. A woman with too much education was unmarriageable, everyone said so. She would become too independent, too opinionated, too difficult. But Simone was relentless. She argued, she pleaded. She pointed out that without a dowry, her only path to security was through her own work. And slowly, reluctantly, her father began to yield. If she insisted on this strange path, if she was determined to be unmarriageable, then perhaps she might as well be educated. And so, at the age of 17, with her secondary education complete, Simone prepared to enter the next phase of her journey. She enrolled at the Institut Catholic to study mathematics and literature, and then at 19, she passed the entrance exams for the Sorbonne. The day she walked through the gates of the university for the first time, Simone felt a shift inside herself, a sense of arrival that had nothing to do with geography. Here, finally, was a place where her questions were not just tolerated, but expected. Here were professors who spoke of Kant and Hegel and Spinoza, who treated philosophy not as an abstract game, but as a serious inquiry into the nature of reality. Here were other students, most of them men, who debated fiercely and passionately about ideas that mattered. She was often the only woman in her classes, and she felt the weight of that isolation, the way eyes turned toward her when she entered a room, the way some of her male peers dismissed her contributions or spoke over her. But she refused to be diminished. She studied harder than anyone, prepared more thoroughly, spoke with a clarity and precision that demanded to be heard. And slowly, grudgingly, she earned their respect. During these university years, Simone began to discover the thinkers who would shape her intellectual life. She read Descartes and marveled at his method of radical doubt, the way he stripped away all assumptions to reach bedrock truth. She read Leibniz and Spinoza, wrestling with their visions of a rational, ordered universe. But it was the existentialists who captivated her most deeply, though she did not yet know them by that name. She read Kierkegaard's anguished meditations on faith and despair. She read Nietzsche's declaration that God was dead and that humanity must create its own values. These were dangerous ideas, ideas that her teachers at the Cours des Sires would have considered heretical. But to Simone, they felt like oxygen. They gave her a framework for understanding what she had always sensed, that existence was not predetermined, that human beings were not fixed essences but beings in constant creation, that freedom was not a gift but a burden, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. As Simone moved deeper into her studies, she began to understand that philosophy was not merely an academic exercise, but a way of living. Every question she asked, every text she analyzed, every argument she constructed was also a question about herself, about who she was and who she might become. The existentialist idea that existence precedes essence, that we are not born with a fixed nature but must create ourselves through our choices, resonated with her in a way that felt almost like recognition. She had spent her entire childhood being told what a woman was, what a daughter should be, what her future must look like. But here, in these texts, was permission to reject all of that, to say that she was not defined by biology or tradition, but by the choices she made, moment by moment, day by day. Her life during these years was marked by a kind of beautiful austerity. Money was always scarce. She lived on very little, eating cheap meals in student cafes, wearing the same few dresses until they were threadbare, spending what little she had on books. But she did not feel deprived. There was a purity to this existence, a stripping away of everything inessential until only the work remained. She studied in the reading rooms of the Bibliothèque Nationale, surrounded by scholars and eccentrics, the air thick with the smell of old paper and wood polish. She walked for hours through the streets of Paris, thinking through arguments, testing ideas against the texture of lived experience. The city itself became her classroom, each neighborhood a different lesson in how human beings organize their lives, their loves, their hierarchies. Yet even as she immersed herself in this world of ideas, Simone could not escape the reality of her body, her gender, the way the world saw her. She was brilliant, yes, but she was also a woman, and that fact colored every interaction. Some of her professors were encouraging, recognizing her talent and pushing her to excel. But others were dismissive, treating her presence as an amusing novelty or an unwelcome intrusion. Her male classmates were a mixed group. A few became genuine friends, intellectual companions who debated with her as an equal, but many others could not quite see past her femininity. They flirted or patronized. They assumed she was studying philosophy to find a husband, or that she would abandon her studies once she married. The idea that she might be as serious, as committed, as intellectually ambitious as they were, seemed to strike them as unlikely, even absurd. This constant friction, this sense of always having to prove herself, left its mark. Simone became guarded, careful. She learned to present herself with a certain severity to avoid anything that might be construed as flirtation or weakness. She dressed plainly. She spoke precisely. She cultivated an air of cool intellectualism that kept others at a distance. It was armor, and it served its purpose, but it was also lonely. She had acquaintances, study partners, people with whom she debated Kant over coffee. But she had few true friends, few people who saw past the armor to the person beneath, the girl who still sometimes doubted herself, who still wondered if she was strange, unnatural, fundamentally out of place in the world. Her relationship with her family continued to deteriorate. Her father, once so proud of her intelligence, now seemed ashamed of what she had become. She argued politics with him, challenging his conservative views, his assumption of male superiority, his nostalgia for a world that was dying. These arguments were not gentle. Simone had lost the ability, or perhaps the willingness, to soften her opinions for the sake of harmony. She believed what she believed, and she would not pretend otherwise. Her father responded with mockery and frustration, calling her a blue-stocking, a lost cause, a daughter who had forgotten her place. Her mother watched these confrontations with quiet distress, caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her daughter. She still prayed for Simone, still hoped that this phase would pass, that her brilliant, difficult daughter would eventually settle into something more conventional, more acceptable. But Simone had no intention of settling. In 1929, at the age of 21, she began preparing for the aggregation, the notoriously difficult competitive examination that would qualify her to teach philosophy in French secondary schools. The aggregation was the pinnacle of academic achievement, a brutal test of knowledge, analytical skill, and intellectual endurance. Only a handful of candidates passed each year, and almost all of them were men. Simone threw herself into preparation with a focus that bordered on obsession. She attended lectures, participated in study groups, wrote practice essays late into the night. She knew that passing this exam was more than just an academic achievement. It was her ticket to independence, to a career, to a life that would be entirely her own. It was during this period of intense preparation that she first heard about Jean-Paul Sartre. He was a year ahead of her in the program, already legendary among the students for his brilliance, his irreverence, his ability to demolish philosophical positions with a few well-chosen words. He was short, cross-eyed, not conventionally attractive, but his charisma was undeniable. He gathered a small group of devoted friends around him, young men who admired his intellect and his refusal to bow to academic pretension. They called themselves the Little Comrades, and they spent their days arguing philosophy and their nights drinking and laughing in the cafes of the Latin Quarter. Simone observed them from a distance, curious but wary. She did not belong to any group. She was not one of the boys, and she had no interest in becoming a mascot or a follower. But she was intrigued. She wanted to test herself against this Sartre to see if his reputation was deserved. They met properly in the spring of 1929, brought together by mutual friends who thought the two most brilliant students in their cohort should know each other. The encounter was electric. They began talking about Leibniz, and within minutes they were debating, challenging, pushing each other's arguments to their breaking points. Simone found herself exhilarated in a way she had not been since her conversations with Zaza years before. Here, finally, was someone who took her seriously, who did not condescend, who engaged with her ideas as if they mattered. Sartre, for his part, was equally impressed. He had expected intelligence, but he had not expected this level of rigor, this fearlessness. Most people, when debating with him, eventually backed down or grew flustered. Simone did neither. She met him point for point, and when he made a weak argument, she dismantled it with surgical precision. They began spending more time together, always in the company of Sartre's friends at first, but gradually more often alone. They walked through Paris, talking for hours, exploring ideas about consciousness, freedom, ethics, the nature of the self. They disagreed about many things, but the disagreements were productive, generative. Each pushed the other to think more clearly, to question more deeply. Simone had never experienced intellectual companionship like this. With Sartre, she did not have to diminish herself or soften her ideas. She could be fully, unapologetically herself. And in that space of mutual recognition, something began to grow between them. Something that was not quite friendship and not quite romance, but something entirely their own. The summer of 1929 arrived, and with it, the aggregation examinations. Simone had prepared as thoroughly as humanly possible, but she could not shake the nervousness that gripped her as the testing days approached. The written exams came first, long grueling sessions where candidates had to produce flawless essays on complex philosophical topics under intense time pressure. Simone wrote with the focus of someone who knew that everything depended on this. Then came the oral examinations, where she stood before a panel of distinguished professors and defended her interpretations of texts, answered questions designed to expose any weakness in her understanding. The professors were skeptical at first, but as she spoke, their expression shifted. She was not just competent. She was exceptional. When the results were announced, Simone placed second in all of France. Jean-Paul Sartre placed first. But there was a footnote that everyone noted. Sartre was taking the exam for the second time, having failed the previous year. Simone had passed on her first attempt. At 21 years old, she became the youngest person ever to pass the aggregation in philosophy. She was also one of only a handful of women to have achieved this distinction. The achievement should have been celebrated, and in some circles, it was. Her professors praised her. Her peers acknowledged her brilliance. But in the wider world, the reaction was more complicated. A woman philosopher was still a curiosity, still something slightly unnatural. People did not quite know what to make of her. But Simone knew what to make of herself. She had done what she set out to do. She had earned her independence, her right to think and work and live on her own terms. She was no longer Simone de Beauvoir, the difficult daughter, the unmarriageable girl. She was Simone de Beauvoir, philosopher, teacher, a woman who had created herself through her own effort and will. And as she stood on the threshold of this new life, she felt not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more profound. She felt the calm certainty that she had found her path, and that whatever came next, she would walk it freely, unbowed, unafraid. The summer of 1929 shimmered with possibility. Paris was alive with a restless energy, a sense that the old world was crumbling and something new, not yet fully formed, was rising from the ruins. The cafes of Montparnasse overflowed with artists and writers, expatriates and dreamers, all convinced they were living through a moment of transformation. Jazz music drifted through open windows. Women cut their hair short and wore dresses that scandalized their mothers. The war was over, the future was uncertain, and in that uncertainty, there was a strange, intoxicating freedom. Simone de Beauvoir, newly credentialed, newly independent, stepped into this world with a mixture of excitement and caution. She had achieved what she set out to achieve. She had proven herself. But she did not yet know what kind of life she wanted to build with that achievement. Jean-Paul Sartre was not what anyone would call handsome. He was short, barely taller than Simone herself, with a wandering eye that gave his face an asymmetrical, slightly unsettling quality. His clothes were rumpled, his hair perpetually disheveled. But when he spoke, when he fixed you with that intense, uneven gaze and began to spin out ideas, you forgot all of that. He had a mind that moved at a dizzying speed, leaping from philosophy to literature to politics with an ease that felt almost like performance. He was funny, irreverent, capable of devastating wit. He could reduce a respected professor's argument to rubble in 3 sentences, then buy you a drink and laugh about it. His friends adored him. His professors found him brilliant but exasperating. And Simone, watching him from the edges of his circle, recognized something in him that she had rarely encountered, someone who lived entirely in the realm of ideas, for whom thinking was not preparation for life but life itself. Their first extended conversation happened almost by accident. It was late spring, just before the aggregation examinations, and a group of students had gathered in the Luxembourg Gardens to study. Sartre was holding court, as usual, arguing about Husserl's phenomenology with a passion that made it seem like the most important thing in the world. Simone listened quietly, analyzing his arguments, noting where they were strong and where they faltered. When he paused for breath, she spoke. Her voice was calm, precise, and utterly devastating. She pointed out a logical inconsistency in his reasoning, then followed it to its conclusion, showing how it undermined his entire position. The group fell silent. Sartre stared at her for a moment, and then, instead of being offended, he grinned. "You're right," he said simply. And then he rebuilt his argument, this time on firmer ground, acknowledging her correction as if it were the most natural thing in the world. After that, they began seeking each other out. At first, it was purely intellectual, a mutual recognition of equals in a world where equals were rare. They met in cafes, sitting for hours over cups of coffee that grew cold as they debated Descartes, Kant, Heidegger. They argued about the nature of consciousness, about whether human beings could ever truly know objective reality, about the relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility. Simone found herself challenged in ways she had not been since childhood, pushed to defend positions, to think more rigorously, to question assumptions she had not even realized she was making. And Sartre, for his part, discovered in Simone something he had not found in his male friends. A mind that did not defer to him, that met him as an equal, that demanded from him the same level of rigor he demanded from others. But beneath the intellectual sparring, something else was growing. It revealed itself in small moments, in the way Sartre's face softened when Simone entered a room, in the way she found herself thinking about their conversations long after they had parted. They began taking long walks through Paris, often late into the night, when the city grew quiet and the streets belonged to lovers and insomniacs. They walked along the Seine, past Notre Dame and the Isle de la Cite, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. They talked, always talked, but the silences between the words began to carry weight. There was a comfort in those silences, a sense of being understood without having to explain. Simone, who had spent so much of her life feeling isolated, began to realize that with Sartre, she was not alone. By the time summer arrived and the examination results were announced, it was clear to both of them that something significant had happened. They had become essential to each other, though neither quite knew what to call it. Love seemed too conventional a word, too burdened with expectations and traditions they both rejected. Friendship seemed insufficient for the intensity of what they felt. And so they invented their own language, their own way of being together. One evening, sitting in a cafe on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, Sartre proposed what he called a pact. They would commit to each other, he said, but not in the traditional sense. They would be what he termed essential to each other, their primary relationship, the one that mattered most. But they would also be free to have contingent relationships with others, adventures and passions that would not threaten the central bond they shared. It was a radical proposition, and Simone knew it. Everything in her upbringing, everything society had taught her about love and commitment, said this was impossible, even immoral. A relationship was supposed to be exclusive, possessive, defined by promises of fidelity and permanence. But Simone had spent her entire life questioning what she was supposed to do, supposed to want, supposed to be. And as she sat across from Sartre, watching him explain this strange new way of loving, she felt not shock but recognition. This made sense to her. It honored what they had, the deep intellectual and emotional connection, without demanding that they pretend to be something they were not. Neither of them believed in the fairy tale of romantic completion, the idea that one person could or should be everything to another. They believed in freedom, in the necessity of creating oneself through choice. And if they were to be together, it had to be in a way that preserved that freedom, not just in theory, but in practice. They agreed to a 2-year contract, renewable if both parties wished. They would never marry. They would never live in the same household, at least not permanently. They would tell each other everything, every adventure, every feeling, maintaining absolute transparency even as they maintained independence. It was a pact built on trust, but also on a kind of philosophical rigor. They were applying existentialist principles to love itself, treating their relationship as something they would create together, day by day, through conscious choice rather than through the blind momentum of tradition. Looking back, some would call this arrangement cold, calculating, even cruel. But in that moment, sitting in the dim light of the cafe as the evening deepened around them, it felt like the most honest thing either of them had ever done. Simone accepted. And with that acceptance, her life split into before and after. Before Sartre, she had been brilliant but solitary, defined by what she rejected more than by what she embraced. After Sartre, she had a companion, a mirror, someone who reflected back to her not what she was supposed to be, but what she actually was. It was not that he completed her. She would never accept such a notion. But he witnessed her. He saw her fully in all her complexity and contradiction, and he did not ask her to be anything other than herself. And for Simone, who had spent so long feeling like an anomaly, like someone who did not quite fit anywhere, that witnessing was a kind of home. The early years of their companionship unfolded with an intensity that felt almost like a state of grace. They were young, brilliant, and convinced that they were reinventing what it meant to be human. Every conversation felt like a discovery. Every walk through Paris felt like an exploration not just of the city, but of consciousness itself. They met nearly every day, usually in the cafes that would become synonymous with existentialism, the Café de Flore, the Deux Magots, the Dîme. They sat for hours, ordering the cheapest items on the menu to justify occupying a table, filling notebooks with ideas, arguments, observations. The waiters grew accustomed to them, this odd couple who talked with such ferocious concentration that they seemed oblivious to everything around them. Simone had been assigned a teaching position in Marseille, far from Paris, and the distance should have been unbearable. But in a strange way, it clarified things. When they were apart, they wrote letters, long letters that were less about missing each other than about continuing their conversation across the miles. Simone wrote about her students, about the strange provincial life of Marseille, about the books she was reading. Sartre, who had been posted to La Havre, wrote about his own teaching, his frustrations with bourgeois mediocrity, his evolving ideas about consciousness and being. The letters were not romantic in any conventional sense. They were philosophical, analytical, occasionally funny. But beneath the ideas ran a current of deep affection, a sense that they were building something together, a shared intellectual life that transcended physical proximity. When they reunited during holidays and breaks, they picked up exactly where they had left off, as if no time had passed at all. They traveled together, taking trips to London, to Spain, to the French countryside. They were terrible tourists, barely noticing monuments or museums, more interested in the texture of lived experience, in observing how people moved through the world. In a small village in Provence, they watched farmers working in fields and debated whether physical labor was more authentic than intellectual work. In Barcelona, they wandered through the Gothic Quarter and argued about the role of history in shaping individual consciousness. Everything became material for thinking, for the vast philosophical project they were constructing together. But the pact they had made was not merely theoretical. It was tested almost immediately. Sartre had affairs, casual encounters with women who were drawn to his charisma, his brilliance, his utter lack of conventional inhibition. He told Simone about them, as they had agreed, describing each liaison with a detachment that was meant to reassure her of their insignificance. These were contingent relationships, he reminded her, momentary and ultimately meaningless compared to what they shared. Simone listened, forcing herself to accept what they had agreed upon, trying to live up to the ideal of freedom they had both endorsed. But acceptance did not come easily. She discovered that jealousy was not simply a bourgeois emotion to be overcome through rational thought. It lived in the body, a physical sensation, a tightness in the chest, a sick feeling in the stomach. She did not confess these feelings at first. To do so would have been to admit weakness, to reveal that she was not as evolved, as free as she wanted to be. Instead, she reasoned with herself. She reminded herself that possessiveness was a form of bad faith, a denial of the other's freedom. She reminded herself that Sartre always came back to her, that their connection remained primary. And slowly, painfully, she learned to tolerate what she could not quite accept. It helped that she, too, began to have her own contingent relationships. She had affairs with students, with fellow teachers, with Americans passing through Paris. Some were brief and physical. Others carried more emotional weight. She told Sartre about them, maintaining the transparency they had promised each other. And she found a certain power in that telling, in claiming her own freedom, even as she granted him his. Yet there was an asymmetry in their arrangement that Simone could not quite name, not yet. Sartre moved through the world with an ease that came from being male, being recognized, being taken seriously without having to constantly prove himself. His affairs were viewed as evidence of his vitality, his genius even. Simone's affairs, by contrast, carried a whiff of scandal. Women who slept around were not celebrated. They were judged, whispered about, viewed as tragic or pathetic or morally compromised. And while Simone rejected those judgments intellectually, she could not entirely escape them. She felt their weight, the way people looked at her, the way her female colleagues kept their distance, as if unconventional sexuality might be contagious. Still, she persisted. She had made a choice, and she would live with its consequences. And there were rewards that made the difficulties bearable. With Sartre, She could think without censoring herself. She could be ambitious without apologizing. She could express ideas that were half-formed, contradictory, even absurd, and he would engage with them seriously, helping her refine them, never dismissing her. This intellectual partnership was the core of what they had, more important than sex, more important even than affection. They were collaborators in the deepest sense, working together to understand existence, to articulate a philosophy that could make sense of the human condition in all its freedom and terror. It was during these years that existentialism began to take shape as a coherent philosophy, though they did not yet use that term. Sartre was working on what would become being and nothingness, his massive exploration of consciousness, freedom, and existence. He talked through his ideas with Simone constantly, using her as a sounding board, testing arguments against her formidable critical intelligence. She pushed back, pointed out contradictions, suggested new directions. Some of Sartre's most important concepts were refined in these conversations, shaped by Simone's questions and objections. Yet when the book was finally published, her contributions would be invisible, absorbed into Sartre's solo authorship. It did not occur to either of them that this might be a problem. Sartre was the philosopher. Simone was the teacher, the novelist perhaps, but not yet a philosopher in her own right. But even as she helped Sartre develop his ideas, Simone was beginning to develop her own. She had always written, keeping journals, writing essays for her own pleasure. Now she began to think about writing something more substantial, a novel perhaps, something that would explore philosophical ideas through narrative rather than through abstract argument. She was drawn to the novel as a form because it allowed her to capture the texture of lived experience, the messages and ambiguity that philosophical treatises often smoothed away. She wanted to write about women, about the particular ways that freedom and constraint played out in female lives. But she was not yet ready. She did not yet have the confidence, or perhaps the distance, to see her own experience as material worthy of serious philosophical investigation. The political situation in Europe grew darker as the 1930s wore on. Hitler had risen to power in Germany, and the news from across the border was increasingly alarming. In Spain, civil war erupted, pitting fascists against Republicans in a brutal conflict that drew volunteers from across Europe. Simone and Sartre followed these developments with growing concern, but also with a certain detachment. They were not politically active, not yet. Their focus was on philosophy, on personal freedom, on the interior life of consciousness. Politics seemed like a distraction from more fundamental questions. It was a position they would later come to regret, this sense that intellectual work could exist in isolation from the political realities of the world. But in those early years, they believed they could think their way to truth, that understanding consciousness and freedom was the most important work they could do. Their world, for all its intellectual richness, remained remarkably small during these years. Paris was their universe, and within Paris, a handful of cafes, a few streets in the Latin Quarter, the parks where they walked and talked until dawn. They knew other intellectuals, other writers and philosophers, but they kept most people at arm's length. Sartre had his little group of friends from the École Normale, young men who gathered around him like disciples. Simone was welcomed into this circle, but always with a certain distance. She was Sartre's companion, respected for her intelligence, but not quite one of them. The easy camaraderie, the rough jokes, the casual physical affection that the men shared with each other did not extend to her. She was the exception, the woman who had somehow earned her place among them, but an exception nonetheless. This isolation did not particularly trouble Simone. She had never been good at friendship in the conventional sense, had never enjoyed the social rituals that seemed to come naturally to other women. She did not gossip or confide. She did not seek comfort or reassurance. What she wanted from other people was intellectual stimulation, and that she had in abundance with Sartre. Everything else seemed superfluous. But there were moments, late at night after Sartre had left to return to his own apartment, when she felt the weight of her solitude. She would sit in her small room, surrounded by books, and wonder if this was enough. If a life built entirely around ideas could sustain a human being in the long term. She thought often of Zaza during these years. Her dear friend from childhood, Elizabeth Lecoyne, had died suddenly in 1929, just as Simone was beginning her new life. The death had come after a period of terrible strain. Zaza had fallen in love with one of Sartre's friends, a young man named Maurice Merleau-Ponty. But Zaza's family had opposed the match for complicated social reasons. The stress, the conflict between duty and desire, had broken something in Zaza. She fell ill, and the illness progressed with terrifying speed. By the time Simone learned how serious it was, Zaza was already dying. Simone arrived at the hospital too late. She never got to say goodbye. The guilt and grief of that loss stayed with her, a shadow that darkened even her brightest moments. She believed that Zaza had been killed by the very conventions Simone herself had rejected, that her friend's brilliance had been suffocated by the demands of bourgeois respectability. It was a lesson Simone would never forget, that the world did not treat women's desires and ambitions gently, that there was a cost to conformity as surely as there was a cost to rebellion. In her teaching, Simone found a different kind of satisfaction. She was good at it, patient and clear in her explanations, able to make complex philosophical ideas accessible without dumbing them down. Her students were mostly young women from provincial families, girls who had been sent to school to acquire polish rather than education. Many of them were indifferent to philosophy, more interested in fashion and marriage prospects than in Kant's categorical imperative. But a few responded to her teaching with genuine hunger, as if she had opened a door they had not known existed. These students became important to Simone. She recognized in them something of her younger self, that mixture of curiosity and confusion, that sense of possibility struggling against constraint. She pushed them, encouraged them, tried to show them that their minds mattered, that thinking was not a masculine prerogative but a human one. But her teaching also brought complications. She became involved with one of her students, a young woman named Olga Kosakovich, and the involvement quickly became more than pedagogical. Olga was beautiful, troubled, magnetic in the way that damaged people often are. She was Russian by birth, her family having fled the revolution, and she carried with her a sense of displacement, of not quite belonging anywhere. Simone was drawn to her, fascinated by her emotional intensity, her artistic temperament. It began as mentorship, as it so often does, but evolved into something more intimate, more dangerous. Simone introduced Olga to Sartre, and Sartre, predictably, was also fascinated. And so began one of the strangest and most painful episodes of Simone's life, a three-way relationship that Sartre later fictionalized in his novel She Came to Stay, a relationship that tested the limits of their pact and revealed the fault lines in their philosophy of freedom. The trio spent months together, the three of them inseparable, trying to create a relationship without hierarchy or jealousy, a perfect embodiment of existentialist principles. But human emotions, it turned out, were not so easily reasoned away. Olga was unpredictable, demanding, capable of cruelty. She played Simone and Sartre against each other, enjoying the power she held over them both. Simone found herself consumed by jealousy, not just of Sartre's attention to Olga, but of Olga's attention to Sartre. The situation spiraled into melodrama, tears and recriminations and late-night confrontations. It was exhausting, degrading even, and it forced Simone to confront the gap between her ideals and her actual emotional life. She believed in freedom, but she discovered that she also wanted security, loyalty, some assurance that she mattered most to Sartre. And that wanting felt like weakness, like failure. Eventually, the relationship with Olga collapsed under its own weight. Olga moved on, found other obsessions, other people to torment and enchant. Simone and Sartre emerged from the wreckage shaken but still together, their bond having survived its most serious test. They spoke less, after that, about perfect freedom and more about the mésanges of actual human relationships. They did not abandon their principles, but they tempered them with a new realism, an acknowledgement that philosophy could guide life but could not dictate it, that consciousness was always embodied, always situated in a particular history and context that reason alone could not transcend. Through all of this, Simone continued to write. She completed her first novel, a roman à clef, about a woman trying to find meaning in a world without God. The novel was rejected by publishers, deemed too philosophical, too lacking in conventional plot. The rejection stung, but it did not stop her. She began another novel, then another. She was learning her craft, finding her voice, discovering how to weave philosophical ideas into narrative without reducing the narrative to mere illustration. Writing became her private space, the place where she could work through questions that she could not fully articulate in conversation with Sartre. Questions about women, about embodiment, about the particular ways that freedom was constrained or enabled by one's position in the social world. As the decade drew to a close, the sense of impending catastrophe grew impossible to ignore. War was coming. Everyone knew it, though many still hoped it might be avoided. Hitler's armies had marched into Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and it was clear that Poland would be next. France began preparing for conflict, calling up reserves, digging trenches. Simone and Sartre watched these preparations with a mixture of dread and disbelief. They had lived through one war as children. The thought of another seemed unbearable, absurd, evidence of humanity's infinite capacity for self-destruction. But history, they were learning, did not care about their philosophical objections. History moved forward with its own terrible momentum, sweeping individuals along whether they consented or not. In the summer of 1939, Sartre was called up for military service. He was assigned to a meteorological unit in Alsace, far from the fighting, a posting that reflected his poor eyesight and lack of military aptitude. Simone remained in Paris, teaching, writing, waiting. They wrote to each other constantly, maintaining their connection through words, through the ongoing conversation that had become the foundation of their lives. But something had shifted. The questions they had spent the previous decade exploring, questions about consciousness and freedom and the nature of the self, suddenly seemed insufficient. The world was burning, and they were talking about phenomenology. It felt not wrong exactly, but incomplete. There were other questions that needed asking, questions about power and oppression and collective responsibility, questions about how to live not just as an individual, but as a citizen, as someone implicated in the crimes and possibilities of their time. Simone sensed that something was ending, that the life they had built together, the life of pure thought and perfect freedom, could not survive what was coming. And she was right. The war, when it finally arrived, would change everything. It would force them out of their carefully constructed intellectual paradise and into a world of choices that mattered, of actions that had consequences beyond the personal. It would test not just their relationship, but their entire philosophy, asking whether existentialism could offer guidance not just for how to think, but for how to act, how to resist, how to remain human in a time of inhumanity. But that test still lay ahead. For now, in the last quiet moments before the storm, they held on to what they had, this strange love they had invented, this partnership of minds that had become the most real thing in either of their lives. September 1st, 1939. The date arrived like a door slamming shut on everything that had come before. Germany invaded Poland, and within days, France and Britain declared war. The newspapers screamed headlines that seemed impossible, apocalyptic. The cafes that had been filled with laughter and debate grew quiet, tense. Young men disappeared from the streets, called to fight a war that no one wanted, but everyone had expected. Simone stood at her window in Paris, watching the city transform. Sandbags appeared around monuments. Windows were taped against bomb blasts. The lights that had made Paris shimmer at night were extinguished, replaced by a darkness that felt both practical and symbolic. The city of light was learning to live in shadow. Sartre was already gone, stationed with his meteorological unit near the German border. His letters arrived regularly, filled with observations about military absurdity, about the boredom of waiting, about the strange disconnect between the enormity of what was happening and the tedious reality of his daily routine. He spent his days measuring wind speed and atmospheric pressure, data that would supposedly help artillery units aim their guns, though no guns were firing yet. This was the Drôle de Guerre, the phony war, a period of eerie suspension when armies faced each other across borders, but nothing actually happened. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible that had not yet arrived. Simone continued teaching, but the rhythms of academic life felt increasingly surreal. She stood before her students, explaining Descartes and Spinoza, while outside the classroom, the world was preparing for violence on an unimaginable scale. Some of her students had brothers or fathers at the front. A few of the young women had already received letters with black borders, official condolences, though the war had barely begun. Simone tried to make her teaching matter, tried to show her students that philosophy was not an escape from reality, but a tool for understanding it. But she felt the inadequacy of words, the way ideas that had seemed so vital a year ago now felt abstract, disconnected from the urgent questions of survival and resistance. Paris endured through that first winter of the war in a state of anxious waiting. Rationing began, though it was mild at first, more inconvenient than desperate. The theaters and cafes stayed open. People still went about their lives, but with a quality of distraction, as if they were performing normalcy while waiting for the performance to end. Simone wrote in her journal about the strangeness of this period, the way ordinary life and historical catastrophe existed side by side, how you could worry about running out of coffee while knowing that millions might die. She was learning that history was not something that happened to other people in other times. It was happening now, to her, to everyone she knew, and there was no escape from it, no philosophical position that could lift her above its reach. Spring came, and with it, the end of waiting. In May 1940, the German army launched its offensive, moving through Belgium and into France with a speed that shocked everyone. The French military, which had spent years preparing defensive positions, was outmaneuvered in a matter of days. The news grew worse by the hour. Cities fell, armies retreated. Refugees flooded the roads, millions of people fleeing south, carrying whatever they could, leaving everything else behind. Simone watched the exodus from her window, an endless stream of humanity moving past, faces blank with exhaustion and fear. She had never seen anything like it, this visible collapse of social order, this proof that the world could come apart faster than anyone had imagined. By June, it was clear that France would fall. The government fled Paris, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux. The military situation was hopeless. Politicians argued about whether to fight on or surrender, and in the end, surrender won. Marshal Pétain, the elderly hero of the previous war, appeared on the radio and announced that he had asked the Germans for an armistice. His voice was weary, grandfatherly, almost soothing, as he explained that France must stop fighting, must accept defeat. Many people wept with relief. At least the dying would stop. At least there would be peace, even if it was the peace of occupation. But others felt something closer to shame, a sense that something essential had been betrayed. The Germans entered Paris on June 14, 1940. Simone was there to see it. The soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées in perfect formation, their boots striking the pavement in unison, a sound that echoed through the empty streets. Most Parisians stayed indoors, unwilling to witness the humiliation. But Simone watched. She needed to see it, to understand what occupation meant, what it looked like when your country ceased to be your own. The soldiers looked young, healthy, confident. They sang as they marched. They seemed to regard the city with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, tourists with guns. And above them, on the Eiffel Tower, the swastika flag rose, red and black against the summer sky, a symbol that would remain there for 4 years. Life under occupation began with a series of adjustments, each one small, each one eroding a little more of what had been normal. The Germans imposed a curfew. Certain streets were restricted. Jews were required to register with the authorities, to wear yellow stars when they went outside. The newspapers were censored, filled with propaganda about the new order, about Franco-German friendship, about the need for collaboration. Many businesses reopened, trying to survive by serving the occupiers. Restaurants that had once been gathering places for French intellectuals now filled with German officers, eating and drinking and laughing as if they owned the place. Which, in a sense, they did. Simone returned to teaching in the fall, though the school system had been transformed. The curriculum was monitored for anything that might contradict German interests. Books were banned. Certain topics could not be discussed. Teachers were expected to instill obedience, to present the occupation as necessary, even beneficial. Simone navigated these restrictions carefully, saying what she had to say to keep her position, but trying to preserve some space for genuine thought. It was a delicate balance, and it troubled her. How much compromise was acceptable? At what point did survival become complicity? These were not abstract philosophical questions anymore. They were decisions she had to make every day. Sartre returned to Paris in the spring of 1941, released from a prisoner of war camp after nearly a year of captivity. He had been captured during the German offensive, spent months in a camp in Germany. then secured his release by claiming he had medical issues with his eyesight that made him unfit for continued detention. It was a half-truth, a small deception that allowed him to go home. When Simone saw him again, she was struck by how little he had changed physically, but how much he had changed in other ways. There was a new seriousness in him, a sense of purpose that had not been there before. Captivity had done something to him, forced him to confront his own powerlessness, his own complicity in a world that had become intolerable. He spoke about the need to resist, to act, to do something beyond just surviving. They talked for hours, sitting in Simone's room, trying to make sense of what resistance might mean. It was a difficult question. The obvious forms of resistance, sabotage, and armed struggle were dangerous and required resources they did not have. But there were other ways to resist, subtler ways. You could refuse to collaborate. You could maintain your integrity. You could preserve spaces where genuine thought was still possible. Sartre was convinced that they needed to do more, to organize, to connect with others who felt as they did. He wanted to form a resistance group, intellectuals who would write and distribute underground literature, who would keep alive the values that the occupation sought to destroy. It was an ambitious idea, perhaps even naive, but it gave them something to hold on to, a sense that they were not just passive victims of history. The group they formed was small, amateurish, and ultimately ineffective. They called it Socialism and Liberty, a name that reflected their aspirations more than their actual capabilities. They met in secret, discussed ideas for pamphlets and manifestos, tried to make contact with other resistance networks. But they had no training in clandestine work, no real understanding of the risks they were taking. Their security was laughable. They met in the same cafes where German officers drank. They talked openly about things that could have gotten them arrested, tortured, killed. After a few months, it became clear that they were accomplishing nothing except putting themselves in danger. The group dissolved quietly, without drama. But the impulse that had created it remained. Simone and Sartre had crossed a line. They were no longer just observers. They were, however inadequately, participants. Daily life in occupied Paris was a constant negotiation between survival and dignity. Food was scarce, rationed to quantities that left everyone perpetually hungry. Meat and butter became luxuries. Coffee was replaced by substitutes made from roasted barley or acorns that tasted like burnt wood. People stood in line for hours to buy bread, only to find the bakery had run out. The black market flourished, but prices were astronomical, accessible only to those who had money or connections. Simone, like everyone else, learned to make do with less, to cook meals from scraps, to stretch ingredients impossibly far. She lost weight. Everyone did. The city took on a gaunt, diminished quality, its people moving through the streets with the careful conservation of energy that comes from chronic hunger. Winter was the worst. Coal was rationed, and apartments grew so cold that you could see your breath indoors. Simone wore layers of clothing, wrote with gloved hands, spent her evenings in bed beneath every blanket she owned, trying to conserve warmth. The cold made it hard to think, hard to work. But she kept writing, kept pushing forward with the novel she had been working on for years. It was a way of maintaining her sense of self, of asserting that her inner life mattered even when the external world was trying to crush it. She wrote about a woman trying to navigate a world that denied her agency, trying to claim a freedom that society insisted she did not deserve. It was a story shaped by the occupation, by Simone's growing awareness of how power worked, how it constrained some lives while expanding others. The persecution of Jews intensified gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, each new restriction seeming small enough to accept until you looked back and realized how far things had gone. Jews were banned from certain professions, from public spaces, from owning businesses. They had to observe an earlier curfew than everyone else. Then came the deportations. At first, the authorities claimed they were sending Jews to work camps in the East, that they would be treated humanely, that families would be kept together. But rumors began circulating, whispers about what was really happening in those camps, about mass killings, about horrors so extreme that many people refused to believe them. It was easier to believe the official story, to tell yourself that the Germans, despite everything, would not commit atrocities on such a scale. Simone knew Jewish colleagues, Jewish students. She watched as they disappeared, one by one, either fleeing to the unoccupied zone in the south or simply vanishing, arrested in the night, taken to the transit camp at Drancy, then loaded onto trains heading east. She felt helpless, complicit. She had not done enough to help. She had been too afraid, too focused on her own survival. Years later, she would write about this guilt, about the weight of having been a bystander, about how easily ordinary people can accommodate themselves to evil when the alternative is risk. But in the moment, she did what most people did. She looked away. She told herself there was nothing she could do. She survived. There were others who did not look away, who resisted in ways large and small, who hid Jewish children, forged documents, passed information to the Allies. Simone knew some of these people, admired them, felt ashamed that she was not one of them. She and Sartre tried to help when they could, in small, carefully limited ways. They passed money to friends who were hiding. They vouched for people who needed false papers. But they never did anything that put themselves at serious risk. They had convinced themselves that their survival mattered, that their intellectual work was valuable enough to justify caution. It was a rationalization, and Simone knew it even then. But knowing it did not make her braver. The years passed slowly, each one darker than the last. By 1943, it was clear that Germany would lose the war. The Americans had entered the conflict. The Russians were pushing the German army back. In North Africa, Allied forces were advancing. But victory, when it came, would be distant, and in the meantime, the occupation grew harsher. The Germans, sensing their impending defeat, became more brutal, more desperate. Resistance fighters were shot publicly, their bodies left hanging as warnings. Entire neighborhoods were razed in reprisal for attacks on German soldiers. The city that Simone loved became a place of fear and death, beauty drained of meaning, monuments standing empty and cold beneath the gray winter skies. Yet even in this darkness, there were moments of unexpected grace. A friend would share a precious piece of chocolate. A stranger would smile in solidarity when German soldiers passed. People found ways to help each other, small acts of kindness that affirmed their humanity in a world that seemed designed to destroy it. Simone clung to these moments, recorded them in her journal, used them as evidence that something worth preserving still existed. She and Sartre spent their evenings in the Café de Flore, which remained open throughout the occupation, a haven of warmth and relative safety. They wrote there, talked there, maintained the intellectual life that had always been their anchor. The café became a symbol of resistance in its own right, a space where thought could still happen, where the future could still be imagined. By the summer of 1944, the atmosphere in Paris had changed. The Germans knew they were losing. You could see it in their faces, in the way they moved through the streets with a new wariness, looking over their shoulders, no longer convinced of their invincibility. Rumors spread through the city like wildfire. The Allies had landed in Normandy. They were pushing inland. Liberation was coming, though no one knew when or what price would be paid before it arrived. The resistance grew bolder, attacking German convoys, assassinating collaborators, preparing for the final confrontation. The Germans responded with increasing violence, rounding up suspects, executing hostages, trying through sheer brutality to maintain control over a city that was slipping from their grasp. Simone felt the tension in her body, a constant state of alertness that made sleep difficult. Every knock on the door could be the Gestapo. Every stranger on the street could be an informer. She had witnessed arrests, seen people dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, heard the screams that echoed through apartment buildings. She knew that at any moment, through bad luck or betrayal, she could be next. The fact that she had done nothing overtly illegal offered little comfort. The occupation had taught her that innocence was no protection, that survival often depended on factors beyond your control, on whether someone remembered a careless word you had spoken, on whether you happened to be in the wrong place when the soldiers came looking for someone to punish. In August, the moment finally arrived. The resistance rose up inside Paris, seizing buildings, erecting barricades, engaging German troops in street fighting. It was chaotic, violent, and thrilling. Simone and Sartre stayed inside mostly, listening to the sounds of battle, watching from windows as history unfolded in real time. They could hear gunfire, explosions, the rumble of tanks. Smoke rose from burning buildings. Bodies lay in the streets, covered with sheets, waiting for someone to claim them. The Germans fought back viciously, knowing this was their last stand, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. And then, on August 25th, the Free French forces under General Leclerc entered the city, and the Germans surrendered. The liberation of Paris was a moment of pure joy, of relief so intense it felt almost like pain. People poured into the streets, weeping, embracing strangers, singing the Marseillaise with voices hoarse from years of forced silence. Church bells rang for the first time in 4 years, their sound echoing across the city like a benediction. The swastika flags came down from public buildings, torn apart by hands that had waited so long for this moment. Simone stood in the crowds, letting herself be swept along in the tide of celebration, feeling something break open inside her, some hardness that had formed during the occupation, some protective shell that was no longer needed. She cried, not just with joy, but with grief for everything that had been lost, for the friends who had not survived to see this day, for the innocence that could never be recovered. But liberation was not the end of reckoning. It was the beginning. In the days and weeks that followed, France turned on itself, hunting for collaborators, for those who had profited from the occupation, who had betrayed their neighbors, who had slept with Germans or worked in their service. The purge was swift and often brutal. Women who had been involved with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public, paraded through the streets while crowds jeered and spat. Men accused of collaboration were executed without trial, shot in alleys or thrown into the Seine. There was a wildness to it, a hunger for vengeance that had been building for 4 years and now erupted with terrifying force. Simone watched this spectacle with mixed feelings. She understood the anger, the need for justice after years of humiliation and suffering. But she was disturbed by the mob mentality, by the way people who had done nothing to resist now positioned themselves as heroes, eager to punish others to cleanse their own guilt. She saw women with shaved heads being marched through the streets and thought about how easy it was to judge, how little anyone knew about the choices others had been forced to make, about what survival had cost them. She thought about her own compromises, about the times she had looked away and wondered who had the right to cast stones. Sartre was engaged in his own reckoning. He wrote articles for Combat, the underground newspaper that had emerged into the open, arguing for justice, but also for mercy, for an understanding that resistance and collaboration existed on a spectrum, that moral clarity was harder to achieve in practice than in theory. He interviewed collaborators, tried to understand their motivations, and found not monsters but ordinary people who had made what seemed like reasonable choices at the time, who had convinced themselves that accommodation was survival, that one had to be practical. It was unsettling, this recognition of how thin the line was between resistance and collaboration, how circumstances and character intertwined in ways that defied simple judgment. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. Then came the revelations about the camps, about the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The photographs emerged, the testimonies of survivors, the documentary evidence of an evil so vast and so deliberate that it challenged the foundations of humanist philosophy. How could this have happened? How could human beings, products of European civilization, bearers of culture and education, have participated in or permitted such horror? These questions haunted Simone and Sartre, forced them to reconsider everything they had believed about human nature, about freedom, about the relationship between individual choice and collective responsibility. Simone began to think differently about her own work, about what philosophy and literature needed to address in the wake of such catastrophe. It was no longer enough to explore consciousness and freedom in abstract terms. One had to ask about the concrete conditions that enabled or constrained freedom, about the structures of power that shaped individual choices, about the ways that oppression operated, not just through direct violence, but through the internalization of inferior status. She had been thinking about these questions in relation to women for years, but the war had clarified them, made them urgent. If 6 million people could be murdered while the world watched, what did that say about humanity's capacity for recognizing the humanity of others? And if entire categories of people could be designated as less than human, as other, then understanding how that process worked became essential. The post-war years brought a strange mixture of exhaustion and energy. Paris was free but scarred, physically and psychologically. Buildings bore the marks of bullets and bombs. Rationing continued, in some ways worse than during the occupation because the infrastructure had been destroyed and there was no longer even the meager. German-supplied rations to fall back on. People were hungry, cold, traumatized. But there was also a sense of possibility, a feeling that the old world had died and something new could be built from the ruins. Existentialism, which had been a private philosophy shared among a small circle, suddenly became fashionable, a framework that seemed to speak to the condition of people who had lived through catastrophe and needed to find meaning without the comfort of traditional values or religious certainty. Simone and Sartre found themselves, somewhat to their surprise, famous. Their writings were being read widely. Students and artists gathered around them, eager to learn, to debate, to be part of what felt like an intellectual revolution. The Café de Flore became not just their workspace, but a destination, a place where you might encounter the great thinkers of the age. Simone was ambivalent about this attention. She had never sought fame, had always valued privacy, the quiet space where serious work could happen. But she also recognized visibility brought opportunity, that she now had a platform she could use to say things that needed saying. And she had something to say. The war had taught her that philosophy divorced from concrete experience was insufficient, that understanding the human condition required looking at how power operated, how freedom was distributed unequally, how some lives were valued while others were expendable. She began work on what would become her masterpiece, a comprehensive examination of women's condition, of how women had been constructed as other throughout history, of how freedom and oppression played out differently depending on one's gender. It would take years to complete, years of research and thinking and writing. But she had found her subject, the question that would define her legacy. The war had ended, but for Simone de Beauvoir, the real work was just beginning. The idea came to Simone almost casually in a conversation with Sartre in the autumn of 1946. They were sitting in the Café de Flore, as they had countless times before, discussing what projects they might pursue next. Sartre suggested, almost offhandedly, that Simone should write something about what it meant to be a woman. She laughed at first, dismissing the suggestion. What was there to say? Being a woman had never seemed like a problem to her. She had managed to build the life she wanted, to think and write and work on her own terms. She had never felt particularly limited by her gender. But as she walked home that evening, Sartre's words stayed with her, nagging at something beneath her conscious awareness. She began to think about her own life more carefully, about the ways she had been treated differently from men, about the assumptions people made, about the countless small adjustments she had learned to make without even noticing she was making them. She started writing what she thought would be a short essay, a personal reflection on her own experience. But as she wrote, the project expanded. She realized that she could not talk about her own experience without understanding how it fit into larger patterns, into centuries of history and philosophy and mythology that had shaped what it meant to be a woman. She began to read voraciously, diving into biology, psychoanalysis, anthropology, history, literature. She read scientific texts about female anatomy and reproduction. She read Freud and his followers on feminine psychology. She read anthropological accounts of women's roles in different cultures. She read novels and plays and poems, analyzing how women were portrayed, what stories were told about them, what assumptions undergirded those stories. The project consumed her, taking over her life for the next 3 years. What struck her most forcefully as she researched was a single insight that would become the foundation of her analysis. Women were always defined in relation to men, never as autonomous beings in themselves. Man was the subject, the absolute, the essential. Woman was the other, the inessential, the secondary. This was not simply a matter of individual prejudice or mistaken belief. It was woven into the fabric of civilization itself, into language and law and religion and science. Everywhere she looked, Simone found the same pattern. Men were the norm, the standard against which humanity was measured. Women were the deviation, the special case, the mystery to be explained. Even in her own life, she realized she had internalized this. She had thought of herself as an exception, as someone who had transcended the limitations of femininity. But that very formulation accepted the premise she now questioned, that femininity was a limitation, that to be fully human required becoming as much like a man as possible. The more she read, the angrier she became. Not the hot anger of sudden injury, but a cold, clarifying anger that sharpened her analysis. She discovered that almost everything written about women had been written by men, that the entire discourse about female nature and female destiny had been constructed without women's voices, without women's perspectives. Male philosophers had declared women to be naturally passive, emotional, incapable of abstract thought. Male scientists had produced elaborate theories about why women's smaller brains or delicate constitutions made them unfit for intellectual work. Male religious leaders had interpreted sacred texts to justify women's subordination. And for the most part, women had accepted these definitions, had internalized them so deeply that they policed each other, teaching their daughters to be modest, quiet, self-effacing, to accept their inferior status as natural and right. But was any of it natural? This was the question that drove Simone's investigation. Were women born to be passive, domestic, focused on appearance and reproduction? Or were they made that way, shaped through 1,000 subtle and not so subtle pressures to conform to an ideal that served male interests? She examined biological arguments carefully, looking at what science actually said versus what people claimed it said. Yes, there were physical differences between male and female bodies. Yes, women could become pregnant and men could not. But did those facts necessitate the entire structure of gender roles that societies had built? Did the capacity to bear children mean that women must be confined to domestic life, denied education, treated as property? The logic did not hold. The biological facts were being used to justify social arrangements that were not inevitable but chosen, constructed, maintained through force and ideology. Simone developed a formulation that would become famous, though controversial. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. She meant that femininity was not a biological given, but a social construction, something imposed on female bodies through education and expectation, through reward and punishment, through the internalization of norms that presented themselves as natural but were actually historical. A baby-born female was not yet a woman in the social sense. She became a woman through a process of conditioning that taught her to move in certain ways, to speak in certain ways, to limit her ambitions, to find her identity not in her own achievements, but in her relationships to men, as daughter, wife, mother. This process was so thorough, so all-encompassing, that it felt like nature. But it was not nature. It was culture, and what culture had constructed, culture could change. She examined the female life cycle from childhood through old age, analyzing how each stage reinforced women's secondary status. Little girls were taught to be pretty and pleasing, to play with dolls rather than with tools, to nurture rather than to explore. Adolescent girls learned that their bodies were dangerous, sources of shame and temptation, that their sexuality existed for others rather than for themselves. Young women were prepared for marriage as if it were their only destiny, taught to measure their worth by their ability to attract and keep a man. Wives lost their legal identity, their property, even their children in many jurisdictions, absorbed entirely into their husband's existence. Mothers were celebrated in theory but constrained in practice, expected to sacrifice everything for their children while receiving little support or recognition. And older women, past childbearing, became invisible, valueless, pitied or mocked for their fading attractiveness. At every stage, Simone argued, women were denied what existentialism held to be the fundamental human capacity: the ability to transcend one's situation, to project oneself into the future, to create meaning through free action in the world. Women were confined to immanence, to the repetitive tasks of maintaining life rather than creating new possibilities. They cleaned, cooked, and cared for others, essential work, but work that left no permanent mark, that had to be done again and again, day after day, in an endless cycle that led nowhere. Meanwhile, men engaged in transcendence, in projects that extended beyond the immediate, that built civilizations and created art and advanced knowledge. And they could do so because women performed the labor of immanence for them, freeing men from the necessities of daily survival so they could pursue higher things. This arrangement was justified through a mythology of complementarity, the idea that men and women were different but equal, that each had their proper sphere. But Simone dismantled this myth ruthlessly. There was no equality in difference when one sphere was public, valued, and powerful, while the other was private, invisible, and powerless. There was no complementarity when men defined what women's sphere would be, when women had no say in the arrangement, when stepping outside one's assigned sphere meant social death. The doctrine of separate spheres was not a recognition of natural difference. It was a prison with a pleasant name, a way of making subordination seem like destiny. Simone wrote with a ferocity that surprised even her. The words poured out, months and years of accumulated observation and frustration finding their shape. She worked long hours, often through the night, filling notebook after notebook with her dense, precise handwriting. She wrote about mythology and how the great myths of civilization portrayed women either as virginal goddesses to be worshipped from a distance or as dangerous temptresses leading men to destruction. She wrote about religion and how the major faiths had relegated women to subordinate roles, barred them from positions of spiritual authority, used divine mandate to justify earthly oppression. She wrote about history and how women had been written out of it, their contributions erased or attributed to men, their experiences deemed unworthy of record. She wrote about literature and how even the greatest male writers, the ones she had admired since childhood, had portrayed women as objects rather than subjects, as mysteries to be decoded rather than as fully realized human beings. The analysis was devastating, comprehensive, relentless. But Simone did not stop with critique. She also asked why this oppression persisted, what function it served, why both men and women continued to participate in it. She argued that men benefited materially from women's subordination, that having a permanent servant class freed them for the pursuits they valued. But beyond material benefit, there was something psychological at work. Men needed women to be other, to be the not male, because it allowed them to define themselves, to establish their identity through contrast. By making women represent everything they were not, everything they feared in themselves: passivity, emotionality, embodiment, mortality, men could imagine themselves as pure consciousness, as transcendent spirits temporarily trapped in flesh. Women became the repository for all that men wanted to deny about the human condition. And women? Why did women accept this arrangement, internalize it, teach it to their daughters? Simone's answer was complex and compassionate. She understood that subordination was often more comfortable than freedom. Freedom was terrifying. It meant responsibility, risk, the constant burden of choice. It meant facing the anxiety of existence without the consolation of a predetermined role. It was easier, in many ways, to accept the identity that society offered, to find security in traditional femininity, to measure one's worth by one's ability to please others. This was what Sartre called bad faith, the refusal to accept one's freedom, the flight from the burden of creating oneself. But Simone recognized that bad faith was not simply a personal failing. It was encouraged, rewarded, sometimes enforced by structures that made genuine freedom nearly impossible for women to achieve. She examined marriage with particular intensity, this institution that was supposed to be women's destiny and fulfillment. What she found was a relationship of fundamental inequality, where a woman surrendered her legal identity, her economic independence, often her intellectual life, in exchange for security and social respectability. The wife existed to serve her husband's needs, to manage his household, to bear and raise his children, to be available for his sexual gratification. In return, she received protection and material support, though even this was contingent on her good behavior, on her continued pleasing of the man on whom she depended. It was, Simone argued, a form of prostitution, differing from the street version only in being permanent and socially sanctioned. The wife sold her body and her life not for money directly, but for the promise of security, and once sold, she often had no way to reclaim herself. Motherhood, supposedly woman's highest calling, came under equally sharp scrutiny. Simone did not deny that bearing and raising children could be meaningful, but she questioned why it was presented as woman's only path to fulfillment, why a woman who chose not to have children was viewed as unnatural, selfish, incomplete. She examined how motherhood was sentimentalized in theory but devalued in practice, how mothers were expected to sacrifice everything for their children while receiving minimal support from society or even from the fathers of those children. She looked at how the ideology of maternal instinct was used to trap women, to suggest that any woman who did not immediately and joyfully embrace every aspect of childcare was defective, monstrous. And she argued that genuine motherhood, chosen freely rather than imposed by social pressure, could only exist in a world where women had real alternatives, where choosing children meant something, because choosing not to have them was equally possible. Her analysis of female sexuality was revolutionary for its time. Simone rejected the Freudian notion that mature female sexuality centered on vaginal orgasm, that women who derived pleasure from clitoral stimulation were immature or neurotic. She argued that female sexuality had been colonized by male needs, that women's pleasure had been defined in terms of male pleasure, that the entire discourse of sex assumed a male subject and a female object. She wrote frankly about women's experience of their own bodies, about desire and pleasure, and the ways that shame and ignorance distorted both. She insisted that women's sexuality belonged to women themselves, not to their husbands, or to religious authorities, or to society's ideas about feminine purity. In an era when such topics were rarely discussed openly, when female desire was supposed to be passive and responsive rather than active and autonomous, these passages were shocking, thrilling, dangerous. The manuscript grew to enormous length, over 1,000 pages divided into 2 volumes. Simone showed sections to Sartre as she completed them, and he encouraged her, recognized the importance of what she was doing. But she also felt his ambivalence. This was her project, her voice, her analysis. For the first time in their relationship, she was not helping him develop his ideas, but pursuing her own philosophical vision, one that implicitly critiqued the male-centered perspective that dominated even existentialist philosophy. Sartre supported her intellectually, but something had shifted. She was no longer the brilliant companion who helped him think. She was a philosopher in her own right, with insights that were hers alone, that he could learn from but could not claim as his own. In 1949, The Second Sex was published by Gallimard, one of France's most prestigious publishing houses. Simone had no idea what to expect. She knew the book was controversial, that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural order. But she believed she had made her arguments carefully, supported every claim with evidence, written with intellectual rigor that should command respect even from those who disagreed. She was unprepared for the storm that followed. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and overwhelmingly hostile. Critics, almost all of them men, attacked not just her arguments but her personally. They called her frigid, man-hating, unnatural. They suggested that her refusal to marry and have children had warped her perspective, made her bitter and resentful. They mocked her relationship with Sartre, calling it proof that she was trying to be a man, that she had failed at femininity and now wanted to destroy it for everyone else. The Catholic Church condemned the book, placing it on the index of forbidden books. Communist critics attacked it for focusing on gender rather than class, for dividing the working class along lines of sex when unity was needed for revolution. Conservative critics defended traditional family structures, argued that Simone was advocating for the destruction of civilization itself. Even many progressives were uncomfortable, feeling that she had gone too far, been too harsh in her judgments, failed to appreciate the genuine satisfactions that women found in traditional roles. The attacks came from all sides, a chorus of male voices telling her she was wrong, dangerous, that she had misunderstood everything, that she should be silent. But beneath the roar of condemnation, something else was happening. Letters began arriving at Simone's publisher, then at the Café de Flore, addressed simply to her name. They came from all over France, then from Belgium, Switzerland, eventually from across Europe and beyond. They were from women, hundreds of women, thousands eventually, and they told stories that broke Simone's heart and confirmed everything she had written. Women wrote about marriages that had become prisons, about dreams abandoned because society said they were unsuitable for females, about the constant erosion of self that came from always putting others first. They wrote about sexual ignorance, about wedding nights that felt like assault, about pregnancies they had not wanted but had no way to prevent. They wrote about brilliant minds wasted on household management, about talents buried beneath layers of expectation and duty. Many of these letters thanked her simply for naming what they had felt but could never articulate. One woman wrote that reading The Second Sex was like discovering she had been speaking prose all her life without knowing it, except instead of prose, it was oppression. Another wrote that for the first time, she understood that her unhappiness was not her fault, was not evidence of personal failure or inadequacy, but a rational response to an irrational situation. A young woman planning her wedding wrote that the book had made her reconsider everything, had given her the courage to call off the engagement and pursue the education she had always wanted. An older woman, married for 30 years, wrote that it was too late for her, but that she was buying copies for her daughters, determined they would have the understanding she had lacked. These letters sustained Simone through the public attacks. They reminded her why the work mattered, why it was worth enduring the hostility and mockery. She answered as many as she could, spending hours writing careful responses, offering encouragement, suggesting resources. She began to understand that she had not just written a philosophical treatise. She had given voice to an experience that half of humanity had been living in silence, had provided a framework for understanding that experience not as individual misfortune, but as collective oppression. She had, though she had not set out to do so, helped spark a movement that would transform the world. The book crossed borders, was translated into languages she could not read, found audiences she had never imagined. In America, where it appeared in English translation in 1953, it arrived at a moment when middle-class women were being pushed back into domesticity after the relative freedom of the war years. The message resonated powerfully, though the American translation was heavily abridged and sometimes bowdlerized, with the most explicit passages about sexuality removed to make it acceptable to American sensibilities. In England, where attitudes toward women's roles were only slightly less conservative than in France, the book was read by young women at universities, passed from hand to hand like contraband. In Scandinavia, where women had achieved greater legal equality, it was debated seriously in academic circles. In more traditional societies, it was often banned, which only increased its allure. Not all the response was from women, and not all male response was negative. Some men, particularly younger intellectuals, recognized the validity of Simone's analysis, acknowledged the injustice she had documented. A few wrote to thank her for helping them understand their mothers, their sisters, their wives in ways they had not before. But these voices were outnumbered by the critics, by the men who felt personally attacked, who saw her analysis as an assault on their right to the services and deference they had always received from women. The hostility revealed something important. How much was at stake? How threatening the idea of women's full humanity was to structures of power that had existed for millennia. Simone herself was changed by the experience of writing and publishing The Second Sex. She had begun the project thinking of herself as someone who had transcended the limitations of femininity, someone for whom gender was largely irrelevant. She finished it understanding that her own freedom had been partial, contingent, achieved only through exceptional privilege and intelligence, and even then constantly threatened. She could not exempt herself from the analysis she had made. She too had been shaped by the forces she described, had internalized messages about her own inferiority, had made compromises she had not recognized as compromises. The writing had been a process of consciousness raising for her as much as for her readers, a coming to awareness of what had been invisible because it was so pervasive. Her relationship with Sartre shifted in subtle ways. He was generous in his praise of the book, called it a major contribution to existentialist philosophy. But there was an edge now to their interactions, a sense that she had claimed territory that had been his, that she was no longer content to be the brilliant companion, but demanded recognition as an equal. They had always said they were equals, had built their entire relationship on that premise. But the second sex had revealed how much that equality had been theoretical rather than practical, how much she had deferred to him, accepted his centrality, organized her life around his needs, while he assumed she would always be there, always available. She did not leave him, would never leave him. But she began to insist on her own priorities, her own projects, in ways she had not before. The years following publication were tumultuous. Simone became a public figure in a way that felt both empowering and constraining. She was invited to give lectures, to participate in debates, to comment on issues relating to women. She welcomed the platform, but chafed at being pigeonholed, at being seen primarily as a feminist rather than as a philosopher who had written about many things. She continued working on novels, on memoirs, on essays about politics and ethics. But The Second Sex overshadowed everything else, became the work for which she would be remembered, the contribution that mattered most regardless of what else she might achieve. She watched as other women began to write, to speak, to organize around the ideas she had articulated. In the 1950s and 1960s, a new generation of feminists emerged, many of them citing The Second Sex as their awakening, the book that had made them question everything they had been taught about woman's nature and woman's place. Some of these younger women criticized Simone for not going far enough, for remaining tied to Sartre, for not fully practicing the freedom she preached. These critiques stung because they were partly true. She had not fully liberated herself, had not entirely escaped the patterns she had analyzed. But she had done something perhaps more important. She had created the tools for others to continue the work, had mapped the territory that the next generation could explore and extend. Looking back on the controversy years later, Simone reflected that the hostility had been predictable, even necessary. Truly revolutionary ideas were never welcomed with open arms. They threatened too much, asked people to reconsider too deeply, to give up too many advantages. The fact that the second sex was so viciously attacked was evidence of its power, proof that it had struck at something fundamental. If she had written a book that everyone could comfortably agree with, it would have changed nothing. Instead, she had written a book that made people uncomfortable, angry, defensive, and also awakened, liberated, transformed. She had asked women to look at their lives honestly, without the comforting lies of natural destiny or divine purpose. And once you saw clearly, once you understood that your cage was not natural but constructed, you could never fully unsee it. You might choose to remain in the cage for practical reasons, but you would know it was a cage. And that knowledge, that consciousness, was the beginning of everything. The storm she had unleashed would continue long after her death, would inspire movements and debates and transformations she could not have imagined. But in the quiet moments, when the attacks and praise both faded into background noise, Simone felt something like satisfaction. She had taken her own experience, her own questions, and transformed them into something larger, something that spoke to and for millions. She had used philosophy not just to understand the world, but to change it. And in doing so, she had finally answered the question that had haunted her since childhood. What did it mean to be a woman? It meant she had concluded whatever women chose to make it mean. And that choosing, that freedom, was both the burden and the gift of being human. The years after the second sex carried Simone into a new phase of life, one she had not quite anticipated. She was in her 40s now, recognized everywhere she went, her face appearing in newspapers and magazines, her opinions sought on matters ranging from politics to literature to the intimate questions of how one should live. Fame was a strange companion, flattering and exhausting in equal measure. She could no longer sit anonymously in cafes, lost in thought or conversation. People approached her, wanting to thank her or argue with her, or simply to say they had met the famous Simone de Beauvoir. She learned to smile graciously, to engage briefly, then to retreat behind a politeness that protected her inner life from constant intrusion. But something had been lost, some ease of movement through the world that she would never fully recover. Her relationship with Sartre endured, as it always had, but it was tested in new ways. Their pact, made so confidently in youth, revealed its complexities as they aged. The contingent relationships that were supposed to be brief and meaningless sometimes became neither. Sartre fell in love with other women, not just desire but genuine attachment. And these affairs caused Simone pain she had learned to hide but could not entirely eliminate. She had her own loves as well, relationships that went deeper than the casual affairs of earlier years. Most significantly, there was Claude Lanzmann, a younger man, brilliant and passionate, with whom she had a relationship that lasted through much of the 1950s. He was 17 years her junior, and the age difference became a source of anxiety for her, a reminder that time was passing, that her body was changing in ways that made her feel vulnerable in ways youth had not. She had written in The Second Sex about how aging affected women differently than men, how women were valued primarily for youth and beauty, while men could remain attractive and powerful well into old age. Now she was living that analysis, feeling in her own flesh what it meant to move past the age when society considered women desirable. She looked in the mirror and saw lines, saw the softening of skin, the graying of hair, and felt a complicated grief. She had never relied on beauty, had built her life on her mind rather than her appearance. But she discovered that intellectual achievement did not protect her from the internalized messages about female worth, about the shame of aging, about becoming invisible. She wrote about this honestly in her memoirs, refusing to pretend that wisdom compensated for loss, that she welcomed the changes that time brought. She mourned her youth even as she valued what experience had taught her. The world itself was changing, lurching from crisis to crisis in ways that demanded response. The Cold War divided Europe into hostile camps, with France caught uneasily in the middle, allied with America, but resentful of American power, fearful of Soviet expansion, but sympathetic to communist ideals. Simone and Sartre positioned themselves on the left, critical of capitalism and Western imperialism, but also increasingly uncomfortable with Soviet authoritarianism. They traveled to Cuba, to China, to the Soviet Union, trying to understand what socialism looked like in practice, hoping to find models for a more just world. What they found was more complicated than they wanted it to be. Societies that had achieved certain forms of equality, but at enormous cost, where political freedom was suppressed, where dissent was punished, where the revolution had hardened into new forms of oppression. The Algerian War consumed France through the late 1950s and early 1960s, tearing the country apart over the question of whether Algeria should remain a French colony or achieve independence. Simone threw herself into opposition to the war, signed manifestos, attended protests, used her platform to denounce French torture and brutality. She received death threats from right-wing extremists who viewed her as a traitor, who believed that France's glory depended on maintaining its empire. Her apartment was bombed, though she was not home at the time. The violence was frightening but also clarifying. She had always believed that intellectual work mattered, that ideas had consequences. Now she was living proof of that belief, her words dangerous enough that someone wanted to kill her for them. Through all of this political engagement, she continued to write. Novels, memoirs, essays, a torrent of work that documented her life and times with unflinching honesty. Her memoirs, published in multiple volumes beginning in 1958, were revolutionary in their candor. She wrote about sex, about her relationship with Sartre, about her doubts and failures, about the messy reality behind the public persona. Many readers were shocked by this transparency, felt she had violated some unspoken code about what should remain private. But Simone believed that honesty was necessary, that the pretense of perfection served no one, that showing her own struggles and compromises might help others navigate their own lives with less shame, less isolation. Her relationship with the feminist movement was complicated. By the 1960s, a new wave of feminism was emerging, particularly in America, where Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique articulated the discontent of middle-class housewives in terms that owed much to Simone's earlier work. Young women were organizing, demanding not just legal equality but liberation, challenging everything from marriage to beauty standards to the sexual division of labor. They looked to Simone as a foremother, a pioneer who had blazed the trail they were now following. But Simone herself had stepped back from feminist activism after the second sex, focusing instead on broader political questions, on anti-colonial struggles and socialist revolution. She believed that women's liberation would come through broader social transformation, that focusing narrowly on gender was insufficient when capitalism and imperialism were the root causes of oppression. The younger feminists challenged this view. They argued that women's oppression had its own specificity, that class struggle would not automatically liberate women, that male socialists were often as sexist as male capitalists. They pointed to Simone's own analysis in The Second Sex, reminding her of her own insights about how deeply misogyny was embedded in culture, how it cut across class lines, how it required its own focused attention and resistance. Slowly, reluctantly, Simone began to re-engage with feminism in the late 1960s and early 1970s. She signed the Manifesto of the 343, a public declaration by French women admitting to having had illegal abortions, a courageous act that helped shift public opinion toward legalizing abortion. She participated in feminist organizations, lent her name and prestige to causes she might have ignored a decade earlier. But she remained ambivalent, never fully comfortable with the label feminist, always insisting she was first a philosopher, a writer, a leftist intellectual who happened to be female. This ambivalence frustrated some younger women who wanted her to be more present, more committed, more willing to center women's issues in her work. They did not fully understand, perhaps, how much it had cost her to write The Second Sex, how much hostility she had endured, how she had been pigeonholed and dismissed because of it. She had spent years trying to prove she was more than just a woman philosopher, trying to be taken seriously on the same terms as Sartre and other male intellectuals. Being pulled back toward feminist identity felt like a kind of defeat, an admission that her gender would always define her, always limit how she was seen and what she was allowed to be. Yet there was also recognition, late in coming but profound, that the work she had done in The Second Sex mattered more than anything else she had written. Her novels, however accomplished, would be footnotes. Her philosophical essays, however insightful, would be overshadowed by Sartre's work. But The Second Sex was hers alone, a contribution that no one else could have made, that had changed not just academic discourse, but the lived reality of millions of women. She began to accept, even to embrace, this legacy, to understand that being remembered as a feminist was not diminishment but honor, that the movement she had helped inspire was perhaps the most important intellectual and social transformation of the 20th century. The 1970s brought unexpected tumult. Simone was in her 60s now, an age when most people settle into comfortable routines, when the urgency of youth gives way to reflection and consolidation. But she found herself pulled into the streets, marching alongside women half her age, chanting slogans, raising her fist in solidarity. The women's liberation movement had exploded across Europe and America, and it demanded her presence, her voice, her authority. She attended conferences, gave interviews, wrote articles supporting reproductive rights, equal pay, the transformation of family structures. It was exhilarating and exhausting, this late-life radicalism, this return to activism after years of focusing primarily on her writing. Her relationship with Sartre had entered its final phase. They were both aging, both struggling with health problems, but Sartre's decline was more dramatic. His vision, never good, deteriorated until he was nearly blind. He could no longer read or write, the activities that had defined his entire existence. Simone watched him diminish, watched the brilliant mind that had been her companion for 40 years slowly losing its sharpness. She became dependent on her in ways he had never been before, needed her to read to him, to manage his affairs, to shield him from the chaos that threatened when he could not navigate the world himself. She performed these duties with a mixture of love and resentment, caring for him because she always had, because their bond transcended the complications and betrayals that had marked their relationship. But there was also bitterness. Sartre had adopted a young woman, Arlette Elkheim, making her his legal heir, giving her rights over his work and estate that excluded Simone. It was a cruel gesture, whether intentionally or not, a reminder that despite everything, despite the decades they had shared, she was not his wife, not his family, not entitled to the privileges that traditional relationships conferred. She had chosen this arrangement, had insisted on it even, had argued eloquently that their freedom depended on rejecting bourgeois institutions like marriage. But now, facing the reality of what that choice meant at the end of life, she felt the sting of it. She would have no legal standing, no automatic right to make decisions about his care or his legacy. Everything she had given him, everything they had built together, counted for nothing in the eyes of the law. They still met every day, still maintained the ritual they had established decades earlier. He came to her apartment or she went to his, and they talked, though the conversations were different now, less about philosophical problems and more about memories, about the past they had shared, about the people they had been when they were young and everything seemed possible. Sometimes he confused things, repeated himself, lost the thread of what he was saying. She listened patiently, filling in gaps, reminding him of details he had forgotten. It was a reversal of their early years, when she had been the one listening, absorbing his ideas, helping him clarify his thoughts. Now she was the strong one, the caretaker, though she felt anything but strong. Her own writing during this period turned inward, became more personal, more concerned with mortality and meaning. She published The Coming of Age, an examination of how societies treated elderly people, how aging was stigmatized, how the old were pushed aside and rendered invisible. It was, in many ways, a companion to The Second Sex, applying the same analytical framework to a different form of oppression. She argued that the elderly, like women, were turned into others, defined not as fully human, but as diminished, as burdens, as reminders of decay and death that society wanted to ignore. The book was less celebrated than The Second Sex, perhaps because aging affected everyone eventually, made readers uncomfortable in ways that gender oppression did not. But it was equally rigorous, equally honest about the ways that human dignity was stripped away by social arrangements that presented themselves as natural. In April 1980, Sartre died. Simone had known it was coming, had watched him failing for months, but knowledge did not soften the blow. She received the call early in the morning, rushed to the hospital, but arrived too late. He was already gone, and she was not there to say goodbye, just as she had not been there when Zaza died 50 years earlier. She sat beside his body for a long time, holding his hand, talking to him as if he could still hear. She told him things she had never quite said while he was alive, about what he had meant to her, about how their life together had been the center of everything, about how she did not know how to exist in a world without him. The funeral was enormous, a public spectacle. 50,000 people followed the coffin through the streets of Paris, intellectuals and activists, students and workers, people who had never met Sartre but felt they knew him through his work. Simone walked behind the coffin, supported by friends, her face a mask of grief. The newspapers published photographs of her, this elderly woman with white hair and a devastated expression, and the images circulated around the world. She became, in that moment, a symbol of loss, of the price of unconventional love, of what it meant to outlive the person who had defined your existence. The months after Sartre's death were the darkest of Simone's life. She fell into a depression so profound that friends feared for her survival. She stopped writing, stopped eating properly, spent days in bed staring at nothing. The future, which had always been something to project herself into, now seemed blank, meaningless. She was 72 years old, and the person who had witnessed her life, who had shared the journey, was gone. She wrote later that she felt like half of herself had died with him, that the Simone who existed in relation to Sartre no longer had a reason to exist. It was an admission that contradicted everything she had argued about independence and autonomy, but it was honest. Their relationship, for all its complexities and compromises, had been the foundation of her adult life. Slowly, with the help of friends, she began to emerge from the darkness. She returned to writing, working on a memoir of Sartre's final years, a book she called Adieu, a farewell to Sartre. It was raw, unflinching, sometimes almost cruel in its honesty about his decline. She described his physical deterioration, his intellectual confusion, the indignities of aging and dying. Some readers were shocked, felt she had violated his privacy, diminished his memory by showing him at his weakest. But Simone believed that honesty honored him more than hagiography, that showing the full reality of his death was a way of affirming the full reality of his life. And perhaps, too, writing it was a way of working through her own grief, of making sense of loss by documenting it, by turning pain into something that could be examined and understood. She lived for 6 more years after Sartre's death, years marked by increasing frailty, but also by a kind of peace. She continued to support feminist causes, though she was less active now, less able to march and protest. She gave interviews, received honors, welcomed young scholars who wanted to talk about her work. She maintained friendships, though many of her contemporaries were gone now, and the world increasingly felt foreign to her. The Paris she had known, the cafes and streets that had been the setting of her life, had changed beyond recognition. Tourism had transformed the Latin Quarter. The old bohemian culture had been replaced by commercialism and spectacle. She felt like a relic, a survivor from a vanished era, but she was not quite finished. In her final years, Simone experienced something unexpected, a new intimacy, a relationship with Sylvie Le Bon, a woman decades younger whom she had met in the 1960s. Sylvie was a philosophy student, brilliant and devoted, and over the years she had become essential to Simone in ways that surprised them both. Their relationship was intellectual, emotional, and deeply affectionate, though its exact nature remained private, known only to them. In 1980, Simone legally adopted Sylvie, making her the heir to her literary estate, ensuring that someone who understood her work and shared her values would control her legacy. It was the same arrangement Sartre had made with Arlette, and perhaps there was a symmetry in that, a way of balancing the hurt she had felt when Sartre made his choice. Sylvie became Simone's companion through the final years, managing her affairs, protecting her from intrusions, reading to her when her eyes grew tired. They traveled together, taking trips to places Simone had always wanted to see, creating memories in the time that remained. There was a tenderness in their relationship that had been largely absent from Simone's connection with Sartre. Less intellectual combat and more simple companionship, the comfort of being with someone who asked nothing more than her presence. Some observers speculated about whether this was the relationship Simone should have had all along, whether her devotion to Sartre had been a kind of self-betrayal. But such judgments missed the point. Simone had lived the life she chose, made the decisions that seemed right at the time, and if those decisions brought pain as well as fulfillment, that was the nature of freedom, the burden she had always known she was accepting. She thought often about legacy, about what would remain after she was gone. Her books would endure, certainly. The Second Sex had become a foundational text, translated into dozens of languages, studied in universities around the world, cited by activists and scholars as the beginning of contemporary feminism. Her novels and memoirs had found devoted readers, people who valued her literary voice as much as her philosophical insights. But would people understand what she had been trying to do, the questions she had been trying to answer? Or would she be reduced to a few famous phrases, a name invoked but not truly known, a symbol stripped of the complexity that had defined her actual existence? The feminist movement she had helped inspire had evolved in ways she had not anticipated, had fractured into different schools and approaches, some of which claimed her as an ancestor while others criticized her for not going far enough, for remaining too tied to male-centered philosophy, for writing from a position of privilege that did not account for the experiences of working-class women or women of color. These criticisms were not wrong, and Simone acknowledged them when they were raised. She had written from her own experience, had analyzed the condition of women like herself, educated and middle class, without fully considering how different women's situations were shaped by race and class and culture. It was a limitation of her work, and she could not undo it. But she hoped that others would extend and complicate her analysis, would take the framework she had built and make it more inclusive, more nuanced, more adequate to the full diversity of women's lives. She received visitors during her final years, young women who made pilgrimages to Paris to meet her, to thank her for what she had written, to tell her how her work had changed their lives. These encounters moved her deeply. She heard stories of women who had left abusive marriages after reading The Second Sex, who had pursued educations they had been told were unsuitable for females, who had chosen not to have children despite family pressure, who had claimed sexual agency they had been taught to deny. Each story was evidence that words mattered, that ideas could change not just minds but lives, that the work she had done in that cafe decades ago, filling notebooks with her analysis of women's condition, had rippled out in ways she could never have fully imagined. She also heard criticisms, questions about her own life, about why she had remained with Sartre despite his infidelities, why she had never had children, whether her philosophy of freedom had made her happy. These questions irritated her because they assumed there was a simple relationship between ideas and life, that philosophical positions could be lived perfectly, that happiness was the measure of a life's worth. She had never promised that freedom would make anyone happy. She had argued that it was inescapable, that human beings were condemned to be free whether they wanted to be or not, that the only choice was between acknowledging that freedom and fleeing from it into bad faith. Her own life had been a series of choices, some good, some regrettable, all of them hers. That was enough. That was what she had meant all along. In early 1986, Simone fell ill. It began as pneumonia, but her body, weakened by age and by decades of heavy drinking and smoking, could not fight it off. She entered the hospital in March, and it became clear quickly that she would not leave. Sylvie was with her constantly, holding her hand, reading to her, ensuring she was not alone. Simone drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused, sometimes seeming to be in conversation with people long dead. On April 14, 1986, 6 years almost to the day after Sartre's death, she died quietly, with Sylvie beside her. The funeral was held at Montparnasse Cemetery, where Sartre was buried. Simone was laid to rest beside him, their graves side by side, together in death as they had been in life, despite all the years and all the other people and all the complications. Thousands attended, mourners from around the world who had come to pay respects to a woman who had changed what it meant to be human, who had asked questions that needed asking, who had lived with a courage and honesty that few could match. The newspapers published obituaries that summarized her achievements, listed her books, noted her partnership with Sartre. But the words felt inadequate, too small to contain the magnitude of what she had been, what she had done. In the days and weeks after her death, tributes poured in from around the world. Feminists spoke of her as a founding mother, as someone who had given them language for their oppression and tools for their liberation. Philosophers debated her contributions to existentialism, to ethics, to political thought. Writers praised her memoirs, her novels, her willingness to document her own life with unflinching clarity. But perhaps the most meaningful tributes came from ordinary women, from readers who wrote letters to newspapers or posted messages on bulletin boards, sharing what Simone's work had meant to them, how it had opened doors they had not known existed, how it had given them permission to want more, to be more than society had told them they could be. Simone de Beauvoir had lived through 2 world wars, had witnessed the rise and fall of ideologies, had seen empires crumble and new nations emerge. She had loved deeply and complicated, had created work that would outlive her by generations, had asked questions that humanity would continue grappling with long after she was gone. She had not found all the answers. She had not lived perfectly according to her own principles, but she had tried, with every ounce of her considerable intelligence and courage, to understand what it meant to be free, to be human, to create meaning in a universe that offered none. And in that trying, in that relentless questioning and honest documenting, she had given the world something precious, the example of a life lived consciously, deliberately, without the comfort of easy answers or the safety of convention. The evening light falls softly on Montparnasse Cemetery, where 2 graves rest side by side beneath the Paris sky. Names carved in stone, dates that mark the boundaries of lives that exceeded any boundary. Tourists come sometimes, scholars and students, people who have read the books and want to pay their respects. But mostly it is quiet, the kind of quiet that invites reflection, that asks you to consider your own life, your own choices, your own freedom. And if you stand there long enough, if you let yourself feel the weight of what was accomplished, what was sacrificed, what was given to the world, you might understand something fundamental. That consciousness is both burden and gift. That freedom is terrifying and necessary. That becoming human is not something that happens to you, but something you must choose, again and again, with every breath, until the last one fades into silence and the long reckoning is finally done. And so, as the story of Simone de Beauvoir comes to rest, let us take one last quiet breath together. Hers was a life that burned with questions, that refused easy answers, that walked unflinchingly into the hardest territories of human existence and returned with truths we are still learning to hold. She showed us that to be human is to be free, and to be free is to bear the weight of creating ourselves day by day, choice by choice, without the comfort of destiny or divine instruction. She asked what it meant to be a woman in a world built by and for men, and in asking, she changed that world forever. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, perhaps her questions can rest beside you. Gentle reminders that your life is yours to shape, that consciousness is the gift you were born with, that freedom, however frightening, is the only honest way to live. Let her courage be a soft light in your darkness. Let her honesty be permission to live your own truth. And let her story remind you that one voice, one life, one woman refusing to accept what she was told can echo across generations, waking millions to possibilities they had never dared to imagine. Sleep now, knowing that the questions she raised are still alive, still calling us forward, still asking us to become more fully human. Rest in the knowledge that her work continues in every woman who claims her freedom, in every person who refuses to be defined by others, in every life lived consciously, deliberately, courageously. Good night, and may her legacy walk softly with you into tomorrow.